Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this, I'm just making a simple point here. So a lot of people get scared because the mainstream media claims that if you've got multiple wars going on, that it's the start of a world war. And that is not true at all. There's no basis for that. And I thought I'd explain how at the moment we've got 3 wars going on, well 2 really, and you could possibly call Israel attacks on Lebanon a 3rd war. So let's go and look at all the wars that were going on from when I was 11, that's the start of the Vietnam 2nd phase, to when I was 50, which was the end of the Iraq war. And so look at all these wars going on. And so if you get to 1970, I was still a teenager there. One point there were 3 wars going on, another point there were 4 wars going on, and by then I just starting university. Another point there were 3, and then 3 again, and then here another time there were 3 wars, and then 3 there going on at once, and then again here 3 wars going on at once, different parts of the world. And these are all over the place. I mean, like for instance, look at the Falkland Islands, that's in the Atlantic, and that's the Iran-Iraq war, which is in the Middle East, and it's war for Lebanon, that's also in the Middle East. So, but they're often all over the place. You know, it's in Asia or in the Middle East or in the Falklands. So in that case, particularly for instance the Falkland Islands, and the UK was fighting in the Falkland Islands, Iran was fighting Argentina, and Iran was fighting Iraq in the Middle East. And there's no connection between those wars whatsoever. So that wasn't a world war, and none of them were. And nobody in any of this time that I remember in the Middle East, in the media, ever suggested that any of these were either were a world war, which some people are now claiming. You get people on television saying, look, World War's already started, utter garbage. And you get people, and they never said that there was about to be a world war, or there was any risk of a world war from any of these things. They're just local conflicts, and a local conflict in one place, local conflict in another place. And even when you had the Gulf War, and that's going to be here somewhere, there's the Gulf War. So that little war there, right? So the Gulf War, that was in Kuwait and Iraq, and this involved 44 countries from all the continents except Antarctica, and Australia, France, United Kingdom, United States. They were from all over the world, and they were all fighting in a tiny little place, mainly in Kuwait, and to some extent in Iraq. And that's not a world war, because it was all local, and these countries themselves weren't affected. And in none of this time, from the Vietnam War onwards, none of these wars have ever involved any country in NATO themselves being attacked. And indeed, since NATO formed, no countries in NATO have ever attacked each other within the borders of NATO, and no other country has ever attacked NATO. So it's been a time of constant peace from the point of view of inside NATO, and large areas of the world that have been peaceful all that time, and at any particular time almost all the world is at peace. So that's the world we're in. Back then, especially during the Cold War, we were worried about a nuclear war. There were people who were worried it would happen, but our main concern was it could happen by mistake. That somehow the Soviet Union would think that they're being attacked and would respond in some way, or they would be worried the other way around. And we have put numerous precautions in place, and we can't have a war happening by mistake now. And already back then there were lots of precautions in place, and they've got more and more, and it's just not possible. So many, especially with the modern world, and so many ways of communicating. I mean, Putin and Trump. Now they can communicate if they wanted to by a kind of secure email that's instant. And there's just so many ways of and knowing what's going on in other countries and communicating. So we're not going to have something happening by mistake. So that's it. So if you look at the current war, we have the Ukraine war that was started by Russia. The only combatants are Ukraine and Russia. You could just about say that the North Koreans, they're more like mercenaries, really. They're not really, it's not North Korea's war. Then they're not fighting for any interests of their own. And there are only a small number of them. And then there's Hezbollah, started up during the Iran war, and its combatants are Israel and Hezbollah. And there's the Iran war, started by US and Israel, not last many weeks, and that probably won't last long either. And those are the three combatants there. So very, very limited. And you've got people supplying, but you always have people supplying either side of the war. And especially with the Ukraine war, you've got all the people that are supplying Ukraine and some people supplying Russia. But supplying a war doesn't make you a combatant. The Gaza Strip, it's arguably, you could possibly call it interstate if you think of Palestine as being interstate. That's no longer in progress. Just some strikes from time to time. So as I say, that's not at all unusual from the graphic. That would just be like then, or then, all those threes. And just like that. And it's really quite a borderline three, if you can't take Hezbollah, because the reason that it's a bit not sure, do you even call it an interstate war, is that Hezbollah doesn't represent the Lebanese government. The Lebanese government is trying to get Hezbollah, they've actually made it illegal for Hezbollah to have weapons. So the Lebanese government, they want Hezbollah to get rid of its weapons as quickly as possible, and this is accelerating that process, which was underway anyway. So it's not really a fight between Israel and Lebanon, it's a fight of Israel is trying to destroy Hezbollah, which is Lebanon also wants to get rid of, although Lebanon would much rather Israel let them get on with it peacefully. So that's the situation. And nobody in the mainstream news in all that time, as far as I know, claimed that any of them was a world war, risked a world war. And it wouldn't matter for a dozen current interstate wars, never reached that number. That wouldn't be a world war, they were started for different reasons. And as I talked, we had concerns about nuclear war during Cold War, but it was a concern of it happening by mistake, some misunderstanding. And we have more and more precautions that can't realistically happen by mistake today. So, and then these couple of other, I've already done videos, but those I think Trump can stop the Iran war at any time, because the Iran will stop too. They never started it, they don't want to continue, it's making things far worse for Iran every day it continues. So as soon as the United States and Israel stop attacking them, then they're not going to declare a ceasefire, but they're just going to stop fighting. So that'll stop whenever the United States and Israel stop. And this is about how the Iran war is likely very short, and how rapidly Iranians have reduced the intensity of their strikes. Yes, I don't need to go into that. Yes, let's just quickly do this as well. So what the bar chart doesn't show is that the Vietnam War was far higher intensity than the one since then. And the Gulf War, again, far higher intensity than the others, apart from perhaps the Ukraine War. So Ukraine does have more soldiers fighting than, I think has more soldiers fighting than in the Gulf, than even in the Gulf War. But it's because it's a very unusual situation, a very long front line, well over 1,000 kilometers long, and it's barely shifted in 3 years of fighting, and they're just sort of pretty much static all that time. And in a war like that, with a very long front line, you just need lots of soldiers just along that line to man it. And that's why they have so many fatalities too, because it's such a long line. And in all that time, it just took a few small cities And in the UK we call them towns. We have for UK towns a little bit larger than what the US calls towns. So Backnort is by far the largest city, and it was about same size as, for instance, Slough or Carlisle or Harrogate. If you look at that, if you know United Kingdom, those are towns or quite small cities, very small cities. So it's been a long war with a lot of fighting, but hardly any change on the ground. Just a few very small cities or towns, depending how you call them, being taken gradually and just street by street, not suddenly, by Russia, grinding through this city street by street, which leaves lots of soldiers dying. And so that's why it's been quite intense, but just mainly along the front line. And just because it's such a long front line. And then if you look forward to the future, at some point, the Ukraine war will end. And they have a pretty good ceasefire that they've worked out. If they can do this ceasefire and this peace agreement, then that will be the end of the Ukraine war and it can't start up again. And then that'll be peace in that entire region again. And there'll be very little else that Russia can attack. It could attack Georgia, but that would never be such a big war as the Ukraine war because it's such a small country. If they did do that. So, just too small a country to have such a long front line. And I think the main risk now of large-scale fighting in Russia might be if Russia itself breaks up. So let's hope it stays together or breaks up peacefully, as for the former Soviet Union. So hopefully this Iran war ends with a peace treaty, and hopefully the Ukraine war ends with a peace treaty. If that happens, the Iran war would end the fighting in the entire Middle East region. The fighting has ended between Israel and Lebanon. It's going to end, the Hezbollah thing is not going to last for long. The Gaza Strip thing, there's virtually nothing left of Hamas. It's mainly a case of how well will the Israelis treat the Palestinians in Gaza Strip, and when it ends. And so that will then make the Middle East a region of peace. The rest of the Middle East has been at peace all through this. Jordan, Egypt, they're at peace with Israel. All the Arab states are at peace with each other. The Iran and Hezbollah are the only ones left that are fighting. So, realistically, it's possible, depending how things turn out, it's possible that by the end of this year, we've got an entirely peaceful Middle East and an entirely peaceful Ukraine plus Russia. And with Russia still probably militant, but the only real fight it can now get into is a very small area like Georgia or something. There's no way Russia really attacks NATO. So this is what we're seeing is the world as a whole. You get these areas where peace gets established. And so it's with that background that Hans Blix, who used to be head nuclear weapons inspector, and he thinks eventually we're headed for a world without interstate conflict at all in the entire world. So it's basically seeing this process expand to the entire world. So it's not that we're going to have a peace treaty where at some point everyone says, look, let's all stop fighting, and then we have a global peace treaty. That's not very likely to happen, but rather bit by bit, each bit of the world gets to the point where it's settled, they have their peace agreement, and they're just too well defended for anyone to think about starting a war again. And in Africa, sadly, lots of small countries, and they still have conflicts, but it's mainly internal civil war things at the moment. And so that leads into my next talk, which I've already done a video for that quite a long time ago, so you can go and have a listen to that. But why we don't risk a world war from Ukraine, the Middle East, China, North Korea, or anywhere else in the world, next to impossible. And longer term, we're headed for a future without war, any war. And that is a realistic prospect. Those of you, especially the younger ones who are listening to this, then So I mean, it's well possible that I live to see a completely peaceful Middle East and a completely peaceful Western Europe and Russia, and no more conflict between in that area either. And it's not impossible that we get in a not too distant future to a completely peaceful world, at least with interstate conflicts, where countries no longer think in terms of resolving borders by fighting, because it's all been resolved, and they just can't go any further, and they have to respect the UN treaty. And so I don't know if I'll see that. I mean, I'm 70. I'll be 72 this year, but maybe that is possible in my lifetime, and I think it's certainly well possible in the lifetime of people who are in your 20s or something, or teens or 20s at this stage. Then you may well see that when you reach my age, and possibly before. I think that's entirely possible. I'm not saying it's not predicting the future. It's more like looking at the current trend, a direction we're going. We're going to a world where, even though you get blips that suggest the other way, larger and larger areas where wars are not happening, and a tendency to much more precise, limited wars, with the bucking trend in Ukraine mainly because it's such a very long front line and neither side got air supremacy, but tends to be very targeted at the military people, again bucked by the Gaza Strip, but Israel is very unusual in its interpretation of international war, with the amount of civilian casualties it tolerates, and that's very rare nowadays. It was much more common at the time of the Vietnam War. So we're going that direction of less and less civilian casualties. Wars tend to be smaller and more precise. And I've talked about the two reasons this was bucked in Ukraine and in Gaza Strip, but that's the general tendency direction we're going. And so we can expect, it's not at all impossible that when the younger ones amongst you listening to me at least, that you grow up and when you're a little bit older, and your children's generation, when you have children, or your generation has children, then they may well grow up to a world where a war is just something from the past that doesn't happen anymore, something from the history books, and eventually also probably internally conflict stopped as well, in terms of fighting with weapons between groups of people internally inside the country. And I'm sure we'll still have competition like the Olympic Games, and we'll have things that we need to resolve in one way or another. But I don't think my personal view, I don't think we're truly civilized, and I think we are going in the direction of civilization, and we will be truly civilized, we'll start to become truly civilized once we reach the point where we no longer have wars. And so you get these people who talk about scrapping missiles, not just scrapping nukes. Does the scrap missiles? Why do we need missiles? Turn them all into peaceful things. Peaceful rockets rather than missiles. Why do we waste flying ballistic missiles almost into space? And so we might well see, but actually do go into space and then come back again, intermediate range and above. And so we may well see a future not just without nukes and not just without interstate wars, but once you're no longer in interstate wars, there's no real need for ballistic missiles anymore, and gradually over time, then those would likely be gone too, and a world where you no longer need to have these huge militaries anymore, and gradually not just get rid of nukes, but get rid of large militaries, because people see that they don't serve a purpose anymore. So you get a huge peace dividend from that, and I see that as certainly a realistic possibility that we may well see, and that I'm following Hans Blix, who also sees that as a realistic possibility. So I think that's a realistic possibility quite possibly this century. And I hope that some of you listening to me may live to see those days. So I'll put a link to the blog post in the video description and hope this helps you.